Flipped Classroom in Teacher Education, a Scoping Review, by Han and Røkenes. This video abstract is made by Sigrun. The article by Han and Røkenes looks at Flipped Classroom in Teacher Education. Flipped Classroom is a set of pedagogical approaches that move most of the information out of class and use class time for learning activities that are active and social. The method has been around since 2000, but became popular with the teachers Bergman and Sam around 2011. Previously, there has been some reviews about the subject, but not with focus on teacher education. The authors of this scoping review wants to inform researchers and practitioners about the latest developments, knowledge, experiences, and research foci in the field. Han and Røkenes' article is a review, which means it's a scholarly paper that presents the current knowledge within a research field. More specific, it's a scoping review and builds upon a 5-stage framework by Arksey and O'Malley. The first stage is identifying research questions. The second, identifying relevant studies. After the identification of studies, the next step is selecting the studies on which ones to include or exclude based on certain criteria. The fourth stage is data charting and collation. Final stage in a scoping review is collaging, summarizing, and reporting the result. As for the first stage, 2 research questions was identified. The first, what are the trends in flipped classroom in teacher education? And the second, what are the research foci and findings of the presented studies in flipped classroom in teacher education? The second stage was to identify relevant studies. After developing specific search terms, the articles were screened through inclusion and exclusion criteria. The next step in the framework was screening out which articles to elect. For this, a flowchart diagram called Prisma was used. Prisma is a research-based method for selecting which articles that is included in the study. After the articles that met the systematic criteria had been selected, the authors developed summaries of each study based on indicators of authors, year, country, research design, methodology, study population, sample size, and outcomes. Finally, after selection, 33 studies were included. Further on in the results section, I will give an overview of the findings of Han and Røkenes. Findings, research question 1. What are the trends regarding flipped classroom? The authors categorized this into 2 sub-themes: general characteristics and research methods. Concerning the general characteristics, the first study that they found of flipped classroom in teacher education was from 2014. The first altogether from year 2000. USA, Turkey, and Spain are countries where a majority of these studies come from, and pedagogy, science, language, and math are the subject discipline where the majority of studies are done. As for which research methods these studies had, more than half did not mention a methodological paradigm. These were categorized based on description in the method section. Regarding the method, most were mixed method studies. On the distribution of participants, over half had only experimental group, whereas the other half used both experimental and control group, except from one which had only a control group. And finally, survey was the most common instrument for data collection. As for the second research question, what are the research foci of these 33 articles? Most of the studies were on student perception. 14 of them was on whether flipped classroom could improve academic performance, and 10 articles were on other aspects. The top research foci is on student perceptions of the flipped classroom teaching approach. 26 of the articles explored student-teacher or teacher education attitudes, motivation, and emotions for the flipped classroom. This is described on page 10. 17 articles explored students' perceptions of content delivery. This is described further on page 12. 7 of the articles touched upon learning environment, in this regard understood as flexible or stress-free, and this is further described on page 14. Another 7 were coded for learning experience, if they explored participants' experience with flipped classroom, both inside and outside classrooms. This is described on page 15. And on page 16, you can read a synthesis about articles reflecting on both instructor and students' presence in a flipped classroom. Also regarding students' engagement in learning. Whether flipped classroom can influence student learning outcomes was the research foci in nearly half of the reviewed studies. You can read more about student academic performance on page 16 and 17. Finally, there were 10 articles with other aspects of flipped classroom. Teacher-educators aspect, students' self-regulated learning, students' anxiety, and students' self-efficiency. This is further described on page 17 and 18. The article from Hahn and Røkenes gives an overview of the trends of flipped classroom in teacher education and a summary of the 33 studies that were elected in this review. When you start reading, you will find a description about scoping review method and data collection on page 2 and 3. On page 5, 6, and 7, it shows a summary or a table of all the articles with research design, methodology, and outcomes. This gives a clear overview of all the articles at once. The findings is presented from page 10 and forward. Page 10 and 11 shows the result of the research focus from research question 2, students' perceptions. Content delivery is covered on page 12 and 13. Learning environment and learning experiences on page 14 and 15. And finally, on page 16 and 17, you can read about the instructor and student presence, the engagement, the academic performance, and other aspects of flipped classroom teaching approach.